Okay. So Daniel, I'm gonna let you or ask you to introduce yourself and just give a little quick summary about your history and then let you get started.
Okay. Let me just change this view again. There we go. Right. Well, thank you everybody for making time for this webinar. And yeah, who am I? I have been, well, basically I started off as a biologist and was studying marine mammals, and at some point realized that if I continued to study marine mammals, my grandchildren would probably only know of them from picture books because they would go extinct. And so I decided to pay attention to my own species, but mainly because I like marine mammals. That then took me to studying at Schumacher College, doing a master's in holistic science, and later a PhD in design for sustainability, or it was called Design for Human and Planetary Health, a holistic integral approach to complexity and sustainability. Like a good PhD should have a big chunky name, and it was also a 750-page thesis that nobody wanted to read, and that was in 2006. And since then I've been trying to explore what all that thinking and all that research that I did for my PhD and for my master's would actually look like in practice. So I've spent some time working with the eco-village movement, lived at the Findhorn Eco-Village, ran Findhorn College to build bridges between universities and eco-villages as applied field study sites for applied sustainability, and worked with pioneers, brought pioneers to Europe, and got invited to join the International Futures Forum, which is a group of mainly, at the time it was mainly older consultants who'd already had their career and really wanted to share the tools of their career with the world. And they sort of realized that they needed to bring in some fresh thinking and some younger ones. And I was lucky enough to be part of that. And yeah, so basically in 2016, I published a book, which I think I've got lying here, yeah, Designing Regenerative Cultures. And since then, I've started to work with social media and putting my writing online, and not just my book, but also the earlier writing. And really that's been the work that has created a visibility that now people are interested in having conversations with me. They could have had them 10 years earlier, but unfortunately I didn't share the information. So I'm really glad to have this webinar because it's another opportunity to share some thinking with you. And I would like to highlight from the start that I'm going to talk for about 4 to 5 minutes. And really, I would love your feedback on this. This is work in progress. This is not the gospel, and you don't need to believe it. I'm just talking about what I'm thinking about this issue. And then I would love to hear your experience, because I know that Diana has a link to the International Society of System Science. And so I'm sure that some of the people on the call will be more expert in all this than I am. So let me just try again whether I can do the screen share properly. It should be this one and here. And then I go into...
Just to remind everybody and those that joined, be sure and put in the chat where you're from and any references you want to share with us about your work. And then any questions you might have for Daniel, you can put in there as well.
I'm trying to get rid of this little window here.
I think you're good.
Can you not see the window of all the people? Oops.
I can see it just on mine.
Okay. Good. Well, let's get started. I also have to say that because this morning I thought, no, I don't want to use a presentation that I've used before. And so I've been building this presentation frantically all day between taking care of my 20-month-old daughter. And I haven't quite finished. So it's good enough. So I like to start by repeating that anything that is said by an observer, as Humberto Maturana pointed out. And therefore, every observation has a blind spot. But I also want to point out, which is what I learned from one of my mentors at Schumacher College, Brian Goodwin, that really you can't be an observer. You're always a participant. You're always subjectively involved in the system you're dealing with. And really, with the title of moving into systems practice, I think that is at the core of what I'm trying to explore today. What it means to be humble as a systems practitioner, to understand that there are multiple ways of knowing, and they all can inform how we participate in a system, and that we all really are both the results of this emergent complex dynamic system in which we participate. We're so to speak, emergent properties. But we also, if you all mute your mic, then we won't have the noise in the background. But we're also basically all co-creative participants of the system, which means that everything we do every day, all the time, shapes the future of the world. And for me, that is really crucial at this point where we are facing, as Jem Bendel calls it, a near-term human extinction. The possibility that if we don't make more appropriate choices about how to participate in the biosphere as a complex dynamic system, that we might not be around in the 22nd century, or only very few of us, is real and present. And we have young children going into the streets and telling the world leaders it's time to act upon this. So while a lot of what I will talk about today might seem at a higher level of kind of theory, I think that's another false dualism that we often work with, the dualism between theory and practice. The meta design that changes worldviews and value system is really the upstream end of the crisis that we face. And so if you change worldviews and value systems, you change everything downstream. And but all this theoretical framework that we'll explore today is really in the context of a very practical and urgent crisis on the planet of how do we respond to climate change, how do we respond to these converging crises that we're facing. And basically, for me, learning from Brian Goodwin at Schumacher College, the key insight that I got from Brian was that science was now at a point where it was understanding that we cannot predict and control a system beyond the very limited boundary of a system, and that because we're always participants, the whole aim of science had to shift from increased manipulation, increased control and prediction, which is really the agenda of the scientific activity since the scientific revolution, to understanding our role within this complex dynamic system and how to participate appropriately. And that in that is a shift from a science that is mainly caring about quantities and the measurable, to a science of qualities that shouldn't fall necessarily into the trap of trying to measure qualities, because the minute you try to quantify qualities, you lose something that is really important. And so another person who is very much linked with the ISSS and the world of systems thinking is Donella Meadows. And in this movement that we're in of people wanting to change the world for a better future, there's a lot of talk about paradigm shifting. And I really like pointing out that there are two versions of Donella Meadows' famous article on leverage points, places to intervene with a system. The first version I like to call Donella Meadows 1.0, where she was still very much that kind of modeling system scientist, trying to just, as long as we have the right data and the right algorithms, we can create predictive models that can inform us how to steer into a future. And then a few years later, after realizing the limitations of that, in that first version, there were basically 11 leverage points, and they go down from number 12 as the least important to number 1 as the most important. And in the first paper, she stopped with, at the level of paradigm shifts, that's where we have the highest leverage point. And then a later version of that same paper is available, that where she added another layer, which is the ability to transcend paradigms, the ability to not frame everything in the frame of paradigm shifts, because what happens when we do that, we frame things in a very dualistic kind of way. We go from this to that. And to some extent, it's in the structure of language. So to some extent, I will be making the same mistake when I say that we need a science of qualities. I don't mean that means leaving behind a science of quantities. It just means that the science of quantities is also only a limited perspective, and we need to expand that perspective and give equal value to understanding the qualitative relationships in the system, because really ultimately the health, wholeness, dynamism, vitality of ourselves, our communities, our bioregions, and ultimately the planetary biosphere, the complexity we participate in, is really all about qualities and qualitative relationships. And just because I was talking about Donella Meadows, I also, for those who haven't seen this, there's a wonderful paper that was initially published in the Whole Earth Review just after Donella died, quite early on, and unfortunately far too early. And this particular paper was later turned into her latest book, which is, I can't actually remember the title, sometimes Thinking in Systems, I believe. And in that, she even gets more qualitative about how we dance with systems. It really is like even the metaphor. It's not leverage points. It's not a mechanical metaphor anymore. It's becoming a dance. She's in the system by saying it's a dance, and it's about getting the beat and listening to the wisdom of the system, getting multiple perspective in, opening mental models to criticism and feedback from others, so we can learn, which is what I learned that I should have done with a lot of my writing 10 years earlier. I kind of sat on it like an academic. It was in some kind of shelf in the university. And because only when we put these ideas out can we have conversations, and they're generative. And in these conversations, we all bring forth the world together, as Maturana and Varela like to put it. And so I really just wanted to drop this in for this kind of audience, assuming that you're all sort of interested in systems thinking, that these 3 papers are really worth taking another look at, and particularly the Dancing with Systems one. And another piece of work that in this context I should mention is Katya Laszlo's work, where she says that we really need to move beyond just systems thinking to systems feeling and systems being. Which again says the same thing. It on the one hand says we're in the system, we're not externalized observers, and it begins to recognize that there are other ways of knowing that are important, that are not just the analytical analysis of data. Because coming back briefly to the crisis we're facing, like Kevin Barron, who I actually don't know, who just interact with him on Facebook, he recently put it beautifully by saying that we're now at a situation in the world where if we just look at the data, if we like what we're facing is we now have to do, like what Kevin said, is we now have to do the impossible because the likely is unthinkable. And I think that's a powerful way of framing where we're at. If we just look at the quantitative scientific data that comes from the IPCC and all the trigger points in the climate system, and we just look at the data of where we're at with increased ideological separation in the world, with the strongmen coming back in many countries, with the evil monster of fascism raising its ugly head again that we thought we long got beyond, then we could easily despair and say this isn't going anywhere. So really we have to almost trust that there's something deeper that is about a transformation of our entire being and consciousness state, that because we're all part of the system and co-creators of the system, if we change individually, we actually affect the larger whole that we're part of. And if enough of us engage in that process, then we might just still have a chance to work that miracle that we now need to work. And I love this Wendell Berry quote: applying knowledge, scientific or otherwise, is an art. An artist is somebody who knows what to put where and when to put it. And I think that's, again, that qualitative ability to dance with system that I'm still exploring and wondering, how do I do this work beyond just talking about it and intellectualizing about it. And so, again, I normally don't put slides with massive amounts of text, but for some reason, like this group really made me go back into quite an academic presentation. But I think it's useful because I learned so much from Brian Goodwin, and these phrases really carry a lot. Like the top one, where he basically says that to really understand how health and wholeness emerges as an emergent property of these complex dynamic systems at the different levels, from cellular to organ to individual to family to community to bioregion to planet, we need to look at the qualitative relationships, and we need to approach things much more, again, from an aesthetic feeling and sensing and intuiting into systems, and not just from an analytic thinking. And I see this all the time, where we have these long debates about masculine and feminine, and then lots of women don't feel heard, and it's partially because we still have this strong cultural dogma that there's only one way of approaching really factual knowledge, and it's the analytical thinking male kind of way. And I don't even like polarizing it between male and female, but it's also the same that comes out with indigenous cultures. They don't feel like to bring the deep knowledge of living in place over over thousands or even 10,000 years into this conversation, which would be such crucial knowledge that we had the stupidity to dismiss as primitive knowledge when we got excited about scientific progress and technological progress. I think it's all to do with this bias of only validating one way of knowing, as Jung calls these four ways of knowing: intuition, feeling, sensing, and thinking. And another person who's, I think, grappling with exactly the same kind of issues, that, again, maybe a reminder for people to mute their mic, because I hear people's telephones and coffee cups. So yeah, another person to highlight in this context is Nora Bateson, who I think with this whole conversation that she now started, and the warm data labs that she's running, the conversation around what is warm data, she's really addressing these same issues. And I can't really see my own slides because of this. Well, let me figure out how I get rid of this bar, because it's starting to irritate me. No, that's not what I wanted to do. How do I get there? Okay, great. So, yeah, I guess the main point that I wanted to make is Nora is another great source of people who want to go deeper into this conversation around how do we value new forms of knowing or ancient forms of knowing, and how do we value different ways of being in and approaching the world. And also, the minute we don't pay that much attention to just the intellectual analytical, then we also can give more value to multiple ways of knowing and different perspectives, because really the complexity we're facing is now so drastic that it's impossible to have just one way of knowing to inform us about it. I'm still stuck with this. Sorry about this. What's going on here? Anyway, I got now my screen is stuck. Okay. No. Sorry about this. What is going on? Basically, I have this screen where I see your faces,
if you go back down to the share button and find what it is you want to share, it may straighten it out.
Down to the share button. Okay. Okay, sorry. Right. So, yeah, again, highlighting this overall shift into what does it mean to radically accept participation as a notion that gives us, on the one hand, an enormous amount of responsibility, because every action that we engage in does affect the whole system and does change the world. And I think it's a wonderful example to look at this 16-year-old Swedish girl, Greta Thunberg, as an example of that it is actually possible for one individual to make a global impact. And it starts with a seemingly quixotic or Don Quixote type action of thinking that by sitting in front of a parliament in Stockholm, this one little girl could start a global movement, and she did. So it's I think we're all called now to understand that we have to become actors in this last act of civilizational importance of the end of the era of empires and the beginning of the planetary era. And if we want to make this transition from the era of empires, from the era of power over to the era of power with, as mature members of the community of life again, rather than an immature species that thinks it can exploit the planetary system it depends upon ad infinitum, then we really need to step from this, not just from ego to eco, but really to step into service and ask this question of what would it be like to participate appropriately in the system. And really that's for me what designing regenerative cultures is all about. It's about how do we engage with our communities in place to make our presence as human beings in our local bioregion or on the planet a regenerative and healing one rather than a degenerative and exploitative one. And so another guidance system that I found very useful in understanding how we make mistakes when we begin to think in this way, that we're all co-creating this complex dynamic system we're in, is work from a German systems psychologist called Dietrich Turner that was summarized in the work of Friedrich Fester in 2004. And he basically, what Turner did is he created a computer model that was simulating what was happening to a fictitious country. And then a transdisciplinary team of scientists was asked to basically run the country and set certain leverage points in the system. And the main point of this exercise wasn't whether his computer model was perfect, but was to observe how these transdisciplinary teams of scientists from different like economists and biologists and very, very diverse group were interacting and responding to the changes that they had decided. And so you can see that like these main mistakes that he pointed out are basically the ones that we constantly face when we look at getting things wrong, basically. We define the wrong goals. We have not enough of a whole systems analysis that really understands nested holarchic systems, and that doesn't pay enough attention to side effects. And then when we react, we oversteer, and we try to, rather than dancing with the system, we try to force the system into new ways of doing things. And one thing that I also noticed in the work of my book is that these kind of lists of common mistakes or principles, they're very often, they stay very intellectual and very I tell you to if you list them in this way. So what I've explored in my book in quite some detail is the power of turning these principles and these guidelines into questions. These are basically the same points that Dietrich Turner discovered, bar the last one which I added. But by turning them into questions, there's something powerful that happens. Because if I tell you a set of principles to follow, I'm basically telling you, I've done the work, believe me, I know what needs to be done, just follow the principles and all will be fine. But if I turn it into a set of questions, then it becomes an engagement. Then it becomes an invitation to create collective intelligence, because I'm actually asking the audience or asking the co-participants what they think about these questions. And it also means that everything becomes much more attuned to the community and the place that the question is asked in. So it becomes place specific and culture specific. And for me, that is like, if I give you a nutshell definition of what designing regenerative cultures is all about, for me, it's about co-creating elegant solutions that are carefully adapted to the biocultural uniqueness of place. And this biocultural uniqueness of place, that we can't find solutions that are global. We can share best practice and best processes. We can share what works in one place, but and then explore in a questioning way whether it might also be appropriate in another place. But we can't cut and paste solutions. And in a similar way, this economic knee-jerk response of how do we scale it up might be inappropriate, because when solutions get scaled up, they often become problems rather than solutions. Maybe it's about scaling out or reaching scale by spreading, meaning that these appropriate patterns of participation happen at the local or bioregional level in different ways, depending on the uniqueness of the local ecosystem and the uniqueness of the local culture. And another reflection here is that in the very title of designing regenerative cultures is a paradox. And it's to do with that paradox of emergence and design, that really cultures are, they're not designed, they emerge. They emerge through the interactions and the relationships, through all those qualitative nuances that we tend to not pay enough attention to in a too quantity-focused science, analytical science. But at the same time, we do need to face the future with some form of action. And so our intentions of how to participate and the interactions and relationships we create on the basis of these intentions really do matter. But it's this dance, like for me, that is really the core of what I would like to have our conversation or questions and answers afterwards on, is this, how do we design for positive emergence? What do you do when you, on the one hand, fully embrace uncertainty and unpredictability and uncontrollability of the systems we're in, because you actually include everybody, and you include the complexity of not just trying to leverage change with the usual suspects that are already agreeing with you, but you're actually trying to work at the bioregional scale with everybody in your bioregion in the context of the global situation. And so you really have to deal with the fact that there's lots of people that see the world very differently. And for me, that's an ongoing inquiry, how to do that well. And as you can see, it's a blank slide, which I didn't finish it. Another set of questions that are basically, they were guidelines, but I turned them into questions that might help in this context, is what my colleagues from the IFF, Graham Lester and Maureen O'Hara, put together in a wonderful little book, which is called 10 Things to Do in a Conceptual Emergency. And again, all of these questions point towards the same kind of qualitative issues, and the same issues that also Nora Bateson addresses with warm data, like these looking at processes of change in different timescales, taking the long view, looking at where the intervention points are that might flip a system with a relatively small intervention into a different state of being, and how to work with the system when you're acknowledging that you can't actually control it, and that to some extent all we can do is repattern the present in order to bring forth a different future together. And just to give you, because all of this is very abstract to some extent, just to give you an example of how I've been trying to do this in a very practical way. Just recently, well, it's now 2 years ago, that in my work with Gaia Education, where I work as the head of design and innovation, helping to write curriculums and create new courses and new materials, when the SDGs first came out in September 2015, Gaia Education was already involved in the process of drafting the SDGs as part of the UN consultatory process, because we're part of an NGO that is advising the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. And so when the SDGs were finally endorsed by 98 nations in September 2015, we set about creating a course to help implement them at the local level. And I ended up with that task. And the idea was to just create a one-day workshop. And I really used this Buckminster Fuller quote of, if you want to teach people a new way of thinking, don't bother trying to teach them. Instead, give them a tool, the use of which will lead to a new way of thinking, as my sort of guiding principle. And what I came up with is this idea of these SDG flashcards that when they were finished, I saw that, like, it was really still the beta version that was sent to UNESCO, our partner in the UN, and they really liked what they saw. And very quickly, before we even had enough time to correct what I would call the beta version, these cards were then translated into Spanish, French, Portuguese, Arabic, Russians, and Chinese. And basically, these cards are structured in the same way that all of Gaia Education's curriculums are structured. We take a 4-dimensional approach to sustainability. So it's not just the classic social, economic, and ecological, but it includes worldview as an important 4th dimension. You could call worldview culture, you could call worldview spirituality. It brings up different responses in different people, but it's basically acknowledging that this second order observation of how do I think about things actually affects how I act in all the other dimensions, and is therefore crucial. And so each of the 17 SDGs is approached through 3 cards, which the cards actually help a group process of living questions in place about how are the SDGs relevant to this place, what is already happening in this place that might help implement this particular SDG, and what could we do to co-create a relevant implementation project about this SDG. And then also cross-referencing to other SDGs in such a way that it guides people into a much more systemic understanding, not just by thinking of each of the 17 from 4 different dimensions, but also thinking about how to link them all up and create projects that implement not just 1 or 2, but all 17 at once, ideally. And so these cards come together with a one-day workshop process, which is called the training of multipliers. And there's a number of other tools that are used in that workshop, not just the cards. One of them is this idea that I just used the basic business model canvas that a lot of people are probably familiar with, and I just tweaked the questions on the canvas to be specific to people working on implementing a particular SDG project. And so that's the SDG project canvas. And then I also created a handbook, which in a very detailed way explains to people how to run this one-day training of multipliers. So the idea here was not just to create a tool that makes people think differently, but also to create an analog version of a viral spread in a way, to basically anybody who's done the workshop, the one-day workshop, who has a set of these cards and has a copy of the Multipliers handbook, which you can download for free on the Gaia Education website, could potentially, if they have just the basic skills of being a facilitator or a teacher or group leader, could run the workshop the next day in their community or in their business or in the local town hall, and or in a school or a university, to engage real people in place around this idea of implementing the SDGs. And what I should also say is that I'm quite critical of some aspects of the SDG process. Particularly, I think that the 169 targets under the 17 goals is where the neoliberal lobby has had a lot of influence and has yet again created this bias, because they're talking about targets and measurements. It's yet again an example of what I talked about at the beginning of this talk, that we're too quantity focused and we miss the qualitative relationships. And maybe in terms of the actual goals, I would say that the goal that is sabotaging all other goals to be implemented is the way that goal number 8 is currently worded as decent work and economic growth, because it's not addressing the underlying issue that structure drives behavior in systems, and a system that has an inbuilt growth imperative because of our economic system being based on a way of creating money that creates money out of nothing when debt is created, and then has differential interest rates on loans and deposits. It therefore creates a need for economies to have to grow at 3% per annum or they collapse. And ultimately, that is a driver of degeneration and exploitation of people and planet. And if we don't address that issue, then I don't think we will ever be able to implement all the other goals. And so yet again, all of this is an example both of an intervention tool of how do we design for positive emergence. Like you can see that all these tools, the cards, the canvas, the book, I can't predict and control and manipulate much what these local groups of people will come up with when they have conversations using these tools. But I can create the tools that will enable them and will guide them into a more systemic way of thinking about the SDGs, that the very tool itself might help them to come up with ideas and projects that will actually result in positive emergence rather than more of the same. So how are we doing for time? Because on the one hand I could go on, but maybe I could also stop here and just ask some questions, and then we can go back.
We're like 45 minutes into it, so
okay. I think then I'd rather than going on much longer, I think I'd rather open up for conversations. And if I then feel like picking up some more of the slides, I can do that. Let me just go here and stop sharing so I can see you all again. That's much better.
So is there anybody online that wants to ask Daniel a question? Just jump in here. You just need to unmute yourself.
Or reflection. This was too abstract.
No, I think it was great. You know, when you were talking about economic growth, I was thinking about Riane Eisler's work, The Caring Economy. You know, she took the GDP and then added all the social indicators to that, and like volunteerism and things like that, that make strong communities and strong nations. So
yeah, we definitely need new indicators. That, I mean, GDP goes up if you have a war or if you have a natural catastrophe. So I can put in the chat box or like in my Medium blog, there are lots of articles on alternative indicators.
okay, that would be great.
I have a comment about economics, and it's really helpful to hear what you have to say today, Daniel. It really, and my brain's going mad at the moment, thinking about everything, but that's a systems thing, isn't it? So in the communities that we're going to be building in Bristol in England, to start with anyway, we're using the sustainability framework of One Planet Living, but we're also going to see what we can do to put into practice Donut Economics by Kate Rayworth. Yeah, and so I'm in contact with her a fair bit, and I've put a slide in my presentation about our project. And so what she's aiming to do is to meet everyone's needs within the means of the planet. So that will become our basic question, our overarching kind of question, and we can keep asking each other as we're building this community and living it, are all of your needs being met? And we've got some measurables from Kate now, and we can keep, as well as having the qualitative bits, we can keep measuring that within our little micro community, we're not overshooting the boundaries. So we're going to start playing with that, and then as other communities pop up around the city and further afield, see if we can keep replicating that. And as you say, each community is going to be different depending on its place, but just to see how things can be tweaked and shifted, and by asking those same basic questions and principles, and just not paying attention to GDP at all, focusing entirely on meeting everyone's needs in our community and making sure we're not overshooting. And I'm hoping that we can prove to our mayor, Marvin Rees, who's still tied into GDP, but I have talked to him about Kate's book. I'm hoping to prove that we don't need to look at GDP at all. So we'll see how we go with that.
But what I would say, one wonderful initiative, and I love Kate's work. It's actually one of the things that I really want to do more is to include, like, bring Kate's work and my work closer together and contextualize them. I mean, from a personal experience, I spent a long time working with the eco-village movement and also with the transition town movement, because I was very keen on this kind of start local, think global, act local, and all that, and trying to create patterns as back then in 1999 when I tried to set up an eco-village in southern Spain. Our aim was to be part of the solution rather than to be part of the problem. But what I have got to in my own learning is that we need to work at all the scales at one and the same time. Like because all the models you're trying to build in and around Bristol are still sitting within this nested hierarchy of systems that are actually fundamentally structurally dysfunctional and degenerative, and they will affect you. And I mean, at Findhorn, we try to live a one planet footprint lifestyle, and just after I got there, the ecological footprint study of the community, and it was half the UK, but it was by no means within planetary boundaries. So it's not that easy to create a system that is within planetary boundaries right now. But what's powerful about Kate's work is that she reminds us not to just look at the ecological transgressions, but also the social foundations and the economic foundations that enable people to do that. But I guess what I would encourage you to do is, because once you start a community process and you really engage with it, it's very easy to create a bubble around that process and to only focus on that. And I think it's important to understand these initiatives in networks with other initiatives that also happen in the wider region around Bristol, and even to think of Bristol within its bioregion, and to start really, like, I moved to Majorca because I wanted to be in a place where I could explore transformative innovation at the bioregional scale. How do we work with community, but how do we do so in the bioregional context? Because I think that if we are to redesign the human impact on Earth in the time available to avoid cataclysmic climate change, we have to come back to patterns that are more bioregional rather than national or only local. Because there's something about that scale of multiple communities working within a watershed to meet their needs, that you can actually get the systemic whole systems design in place to do what you're trying to do.
Yes, and because we're looking at natural building, and one of the sites we're looking at has a woodland right next door with lots of hazel coppice that we can use to start building with. But we're also talking to people who have a license to grow hemp in the bioregion, and starting to talk with them if we could start to create some kind of resource and local economy where we get the materials we need to build the houses in the city, in the bioregion, grow them locally, and encourage local landowners to do that.
I mean, for me, when I say the redesign is bioregional, I think it's also about creating circular economies at the bioregional scale that don't make the mistake that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation tends to make when they talk about the two cycles of the industrial metabolism and the biological metabolism, and they talk about it as if the industrial metabolism cycle could go on forever. But and they use this fancy word upcycling, and basically it's physically and chemically impossible and energetically impossible to upcycle these kind of elements continuously forever. What we really need to do is to, over the next 100, 150, 200 years, contract that industrial metabolism and grow the biological metabolism. And in doing so, that's the process of climate change reversal, because we bring carbon back into the soil, we bring carbon back into standing forests, we bring carbon back into the biomaterials, the houses, everything we use. And in doing so, we not only build these regeneratively grown biomaterials and local or regional food economies, which will give people jobs and work on the social foundations in terms of Kate's work, but we also basically create a response to climate change. And so I think it's vital work, but it's in its infancy. We still have a lot of work to do. Maybe we just take a few questions and then I answer them rather than. Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question or comment?
Sure, I'd love to jump in there, Daniel. It's Mark Rowland's here. Actually, it's my wife that's name's up there. Loving your conversation. It's fantastic. area that my wife and I are focused on right now is basically trying to energize the movement within people and outside of with organizations and governance. So looking at the schedule, if you will, and being an engineer, I tend to be very pragmatic. Looking at the tightness of the schedule, I know you've mentioned that's a very hopeful schedule of 12 years to make a difference. And we're going to have to weather some serious storms that we have to get moving as fast as possible. So I'm myself looking at systems of governance and how we can actually affect the changes and movements within our governments that are very caught in their own paradigms at the moment, still very much here in Vancouver, Canada, very much a capitalistic paradigm. And everything stems from that. So the trying to build hope in the message, joy in the messaging, that we have this incredible opportunity in the human civilization where we have a lever or a huge catalyst here for potential global change towards the vision that includes much of which is the global goals. The block being the lack of trust and those borders in the sand, and they're not bio regions, they're actually countries that are with lines and limits based on cultures, and that are blocking much of this. And a lot of the power and control still remains there. And so, you know, when you're seeing some of these incredible movements, I'm getting to my question, some of these incredible movements with systems thinking, Capra, with Theory U, and there's just so many more, is how to pull these together into a real force where we can start to move towards these political systems and start to, I guess, encourage the politicians to start seeing the world and from a different paradigm to create that very fast change. Do you think that's possible to do that, to get that kind of movement? And if not, then how do we move fast enough?
That's the big question, isn't it? Do we want to take a couple more questions, or shall I answer this one first? What do people?
Go ahead and take.
Okay. Well, yes. Where do I start on that one? In other parts of my writing, if you go onto my Medium blog and you just put in my name and Medium and then 3 horizons, you'll get a number of links to this 3 horizon model that is quite useful to start thinking about these big transitions that we need to make. And the reason why I bring this up is because the conventional sort of nation state, what is called Horizon 1 in this system, that you're addressing as being still stuck in the old paradigm. One way of shifting it is to really pay more attention to what's already growing. Some of the movements you've mentioned. There's a talk that I gave at Findhorn that you can find on the internet on human and planetary health, where I list a lot of these movements around the planet. Ecosystems restoration camps, the Capital Institute's Regenerative Communities Network, and their focus sites where people around the world have already committed to creating bioregional regenerative economies, and trying to create whole systems prototypes at that scale. And I think that we need to combine all that work rather than get too hung up in arguing against each other about whether it has to be regenerative or flourishing or thriving, or all these different words that we like to use, to recognize that we're all part of these regenerative cultures emerging. As Paul Hawkins so beautifully put it, it's the planet's immune response to the crisis that is speaking through us as planet, doing all this work, and to really cherish the diversity and the plurality of approaches, almost like to see which one works. And because another thing to keep in mind is that as we communicate about this to people, there is no one language that will reach people equally. Like if you look at the spiral dynamics or the integral model, people are at different stages of personal development, and they will be triggered by certain words. Like if I talk to you about shared decision making and participatory governance, you will resonate. If I say that to somebody who's in a different mindset, they will consider it as something challenging. So there's a wonderful article by Barrett Brown called Communicating Sustainability that he wrote in 2009 in Cosmos Journal. And it's a great example of how we need to message our message in different ways to different people. And it's not selling out. Like it's just being skillful about how do you begin? You mentioned trust. How do you begin to build trust by not alienating people from the start and coming in with a vision that they're not able to swallow yet, but to take people, pick them up where they're at. And in many ways, I think that the SDGs are a platform that allow us that, because they're systemic enough to address quite a lot of the issues we do need to address, but they're relatively conventional platform that was built on a multi-sector, multi-stakeholder process. And then just briefly to how do we get to scale, I'm constantly grappling with that question, and more and more I'm realizing that I've been talking in my own echo chamber, that the people that I've got on the different Facebook groups and in my Twitter feed and so on, or the people that I meet at conferences, we're all in the same echo chamber. And we're talking to each other about this. And yes, the echo chamber is growing, what I like to call the regeneration rising. It's becoming a bigger and bigger echo chamber. But what I think we really need to engage is all the cultural creative mechanisms. I think we need to engage the musicians, the theater, plays, artists, fine art, on all scales, the big names and the small neighborhood busker, to basically bring this way of thinking and this way of seeing into the public and cultural discourse in as diverse a way as possible. And I'm beginning to work with a foundation on these issues, like how do we create a traveling exhibition on biomimicry or on regenerative development and regenerative design, in a way that engages some of the big names in the art industry, and through them then brings people into this conversation that might just come because each one of the exhibits also has a painting by a famous artist, but then they engage with the material of the exhibit in a deeper way, and you begin to build bridges to those other constituencies. And similar way, on the 10th of May, I'm hoping to meet a very famous, might as well mention his name, Lenny Kravitz. Somebody's trying to put me together with Lenny Kravitz to have a conversation how his work, which is already, I don't know if you listen to some of the lyrics from his latest album, Raising Vibrations. I hadn't listened to some of his stuff for probably a decade, but when I tuned into that album, I realized that it speaks the same language as the Regeneration Rising. It speaks a language of, one song, for example, is called It's Enough, and another one is called Here to Love. And they really do acupuncture with the social system and address these issues. And I think once we engage the music industry and reach 2 or 3 billion people on the planet at a very shallow level, if that's the funnel that then brings only 4 or 5% of them to the next level, and then 1% of those to a deeper level, we will already have a much different situation as we have now. We will have created critical mass. So that's why I'm putting my work towards at the moment.
That's exciting, Daniel.
Thank you.
And I think you brought up an important thing, or described an important aspect of getting our beliefs out, because we're very passionate about this, and we know that we need to do this, but we have to find the right language and the right avenues and the right everything to actually interact with people who don't quite get it.
Yeah.
And that is a tap dance at times to try to figure out what is the right language.
Absolutely. And I find it's people can also fall into the trap of saying, oh, I can't mention this to my client, or I can't mention this to the head of the city planning board because they'll think I'm strange. I always find if you find the right language and the right entry points, and you build trust on a couple of issues, it is okay to then say, naming that the larger vision is a longer term vision and might not be for tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, but it is important to also push the boundaries and name these real transformative changes. I think people have responded quite well to some of the memes I've been putting out, which are these kind of audacious statements like redesigning the human impact on Earth. That's massive. Yeah? But I think that's ultimately what we're challenged to do, but we're not going to do it at a global scale from the start. It's this idea that you might have heard this word glocal, this putting together the word global and local. And I think that the transformative action that is needed now is local action. It is working one at the same time, locally, bioregionally, and globally. And particularly, while the regenerative solutions are adapted to the biocultural uniqueness of place and region, the enabling factor is the global collaboration and knowledge exchange. And I'd love to hear Johnny's take on, because he's preparing this wonderful conference in Malaga coming up very soon on social innovation. And how does this all connect to what you're going to be talking about at Nessie?
Well, the first thing I would like to say is that I started in a project 20 years ago that was called Global Ecosystems. So global, it sounds very, very connected to me. And it's a term that I've been using, and in my methodology that I'm sharing for these 20 years is based on the concept that we have to go to separate the global bits, like the immaterial world has to go global, but the material world has to go local. So it's local atoms and global bits. So it has to, we have to differentiate these two aspects of the economy and the reality. What things are immaterial, what needs we have that are immaterial. And in the eco-village movement, from where I come from, where I live in an eco-village, and I'm part of the eco-village movement, and I'm head of economy in the eco-village movement in Spain. We believe that we have to solve our needs, our immaterial needs, in a completely different way as we solve the material needs. So we have to go out of this materialism and focus in more in different ways of solving the economy. So in Nessie, and that was the question I wanted to pose you, is we are planning to create a vision of the 2030, have a good vision that people can be inspired to go, because we are talking about a lot of catastrophic situation that we have right now, but I think people need hope. People need to see a place where we can go, and that's exactly what we are going to do in Nessie. We are going to try to create like an environment where people can live what the world could be in 2030 in these 6 strands that we divided in Nessie: food and energy and housing and finance and all these different strands. And we're going to try to work to create a design, create a plan to go there. But for me, what I would like to hear from you is, how do you see a realistic but ideal future in 2030 with this way of thinking, which I completely share?
Well, I heard from Thomas Lara that you were at Nessie trying to work with the 3 Horizons framework that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
To play with it. And part of the strength of this 3 Horizon framework is that none of the 3 horizons disappear. So you have the old system that also, the red line still exists on the far end of where the 3rd horizon has become dominant. And that's a key message, that we need to also ask what is valuable about the current system that we actually still want to have in 2030 or 2050. I would almost suggest to push this time horizon out a little further, like 2045, because 2030 is very close for some real transformative changes to have happened by then. And while I completely understand that in order to manage a large group of 600 or 700 people in different parallel streams, you need to create these themes. But that's to some extent part of the old way of thinking, to go food, economy, housing, transport, because somehow they're also all related. So if for process sake, to manage the people, you want to start off with that theme. Find processes that also engage people to say, okay, what are the common grounds and what are the intersection points between these things? How does transport relate to economy? How does housing relate to climate, or whatever the themes are? I can't remember the ones you mentioned. But basically find a place to reintegrate that false separation that you created by keeping it in the thematics. And the other thing that I find really powerful about the Three Horizon framework is that when you've done that long journey of, okay, you've got the red horizon 1 is dips down and becomes less prevalent. You have the green horizon 3 becoming more prevalent, and then you use the bridge, which is really the social innovation and innovation bridge of the second horizon, to avoid collapse and rebuild, and actually use that bridge to get into a future without the trauma that would come with a collapse. It's a powerful model, partially because when you get to the top of the green hill of the third horizon being prevalent, and you look down at what you're standing on red ground. Like you're the new horizon 1. And that, I think, is a powerful. So I'm not going to answer you the question of where do I think we're going to be in 2030, because I think we're still going to be on that journey, and it's a journey that will never end. The journey of creating regenerative cultures is because of this dynamic understanding of process and of our strange embeddedness in this process. What you were saying, that the inner and the outer, the material and the information are linked, and they inform each other. They bring forth each other. Therefore, this process of inquiry will go on forever. And all we can do is to try to build the capacity of people in place to keep responding to changes at the local, regional, and global scale in ways that increases the viability and regenerative capacity of the system overall. And so really because also in response to the other question earlier, like even if we get it right, in my opinion, even if we get it right and we do get to scale, or like there's enough of a demand, like let's say Fridays for Futures and Parents for Futures get together and build the political demand, that political leaders start responding and business starts responding. Yeah? We're facing this bizarre situation that like 2021 to 2030 is the UN decade for ecosystems restoration. Let's say we really put our effort behind it, and we pair this idea with a climate change reversal response, and we pair this idea with donut economics, and we say we want to create the social foundations and live within planetary boundaries. Even if we did all that as humanity, if for some reason we coordinated our human family in that way, we still have to be honest about the fact that it will be a lot of hard work, and in the next 10, 15 years, things might still get worse, even if in the next 1 or 2 years we all decide to make the right decisions and we all start working on it full power. And I think for our movement, for the people that are going to be gathered at Nessie, it's really important to be clear that because otherwise what we're going to get is this initial, oh, wow, the regeneration is rising and we're all doing it. And then after 3, 4, 5 years, things are still getting worse in terms of climate change effects and global floods and catastrophes. And then people are saying, it's not working. Yeah? The reality is that there's a feedback, like there's a delay in the system. That is why we took so bloody long to respond. 50 years we've been knowing about that we needed to respond to this, and we're only just about getting ready for it. You said Global 20 years ago you started the system. We need to be honest that the next 3 decades, I think, are going to be a really rough ride, and we will see a lot of collapse, and we will see a lot of breakdown, and we need to celebrate that collapse and that breakdown as the dissolution of systems, patterns, and system structures that no longer serve, and not be fearful of the loss of terra firma and institutions crumbling. But we also need to be really, really clear that even if we get it right, we're in it for the long haul, and we never really, neither there is no destination sustainability and there is no destination regenerative culture that is perfect, and that we, once we're there, we can down tools and live happily ever after. It's a continuous journey. Sorry to disappoint.
No, it's totally fine. Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think it's very smart to prepare for some things that are not going to work so straightforward and so fast. So yeah, it's important to have that in mind. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Diane, you're keeping time. How are we doing?
We're doing good. It's about 15 after, so you got about 15 minutes.
Great. Anybody else? Comments?
Yes, here, Daniel.
Hi.
Oh, first, sorry about my English, but I will try to do my best here. All right. First, I have to thank you, Daniel, because you have been an inspiration of my journey as a systems thinker and practitioner as well. So I'm basically a person that is facing a transition from the story of separation to the story of integration, and therefore kind of grasping how we are participants of this creative power of the universe. So, and in this way, I was, I was working in business as usual as a marketer about 50 years, and I started to identify some disconnects between the being, the saying, and the doing of business organizations. So I started about six years ago a social endeavor. I call it JSS Interactive. It's a systemic consultancy that we are aiming to develop human organizations as reflexive, conversational, and interdependent living systems. So in this way, we are working in what we call it the eco-bio-psychosocial capital, el capital eco-bio-psicosocial. And you have been really helpful in giving shape of this view that is just starting, it's just emerging. And I just want to say it will be great to be in touch with you and keep on working on this view. And that's all. That's more than a question. Is I'm really grateful for having this opportunity of conversing with this collective mind. We certainly need to keep reinforcing this view. And I totally agree. I am really convinced that we need to start for the beginning, and education is it's important. It's important how we can change, how we can cultivate new seeds of education, because education is the basis of all this change. We cannot do anything if we don't intervene education, and that's my main preoccupation. Thank you.
Thank you for the feedback, because it's always like sometimes one wonders why I spend long nights putting stuff up on Medium or posting things, and so it's always deeply appreciated to get feedback like this, that it actually was meaningful to somebody. And I would agree that education is crucial in all of this, because like that definition of design, human intentionality expressed through interactions and relationships. So the most upstream intervention that we can make is to change intentionality, because then, so change the why we design, because then the how and the what we design changes immediately once we change the why. And that why change happens through some form of education. But education has unfortunately very often been misunderstood as something that you do in the first third of your life, and then you just work and then you retire. And I think that one of the great mentors of regenerative development in the Regenesis group, one of the key principles of regenerative development is local or regional capacity building, like building the capacity of people to live this dynamic process of adapting. And so really education is a lifelong learning process that needs to be at the core of what regenerative cultures are really all about. And that's why, like, when I first started writing my book, it was actually the working title I started the book under was called Living the Questions Together. This importance of questions and the importance of engaging with other people around questions, because that very process is the process of building the capacity of people to respond to change in a way that is meaningful to their culture and that is appropriate to the ecosystem that they live in. So in, again, the regenerative development work of the Regenesis group and of Kara Sanford, they speak of 3 levels of work in working regeneratively. And the first level is personal development, the individual. Like, it starts with the individual and our own work on ourselves and our capacity to communicate and our capacity to learn and think systemically, think in patterns, all of that. So that's the work of the designer, him or herself. Then the next level of work is the design process, and which I would say is that engaging with others in this process of living the question, this dynamic, not trying to find the solutions and the answers, but to actually live the questions more deeply. It's this wonderful quote that I start my book with by Rainer Maria Rilke, where he writes in a letter to a young poet, you must live the questions more deeply, because you might not be able to understand the answers yet. And only if you live the questions, then maybe one fine day will you live into the answers. And for me, so that's the second level of work, this process of inquiry of how do we redesign the human presence on Earth, but how do we do it in this place, out of this place, in the context of its culture and its history. And then the third level of work is what you design. So the processes and structures and systems you put into place. And if they are designed regeneratively by people who work on the first and the second level, then they should really increase the value and the health and vitality of the systems that they're touching. And that's where I also see that my previous work in my PhD and the work of the Regenesis group and regenerative development is very aligned, because like I work with this notion of salutogenic or health generating design. And really, when they say increasing the value or health of the system, to me that's very much the same issue. Like, if we only asked ourselves one question with everything we do in this kind of 7th generation type way, does it increase the health, wholeness, and vitality of the local, the regional, and the global system? That's a powerful question to keep asking about all decisions. And if for some reason we feel it doesn't, then it might not be appropriate participation. Okay, is there time for one more? Or we're probably...
We have 5 minutes left. Is there some parting words you want to give us, or?
Well, I'm just always encouraged that people actually make the time to engage with the conversation like this. Another part of me is kind of going, oh, there's 7 people that dropped out. Maybe they didn't like what we talked about, but that's just to show that the person...
I think they all had another engagement, but they want the recording.
Yeah, no, I'm trying not to take it personal,
No,
but just to make transparent that the personal development process is ongoing as well. Like I still kind of go, oh, maybe I was too heady, and all these things that don't really serve us. To be like, one has to be self-critical, but not self-sabotaging. And yeah, so thank you all just for caring, for living into these questions, and for doing it in your community in whatever way you're doing your work, because it is all of us that are going to make the difference. That's what I'm absolutely convinced by, and that gives me a lot of hope, because it also means that we can be more gentle with ourselves when we need to just take care of our own needs and energies sometimes. Because I've like the problem with activists and trying to work for a better world is that it's easy to lose oneself in burning out over that work. And I always remember that, like, when I trained in the way of counsel, and one of the core principles of the way of counsel is that you always have to ask the question, which is actually a deep indigenous wisdom. Ask the question, with anything you do, does it serve myself? Does it serve my community? And does it serve life, or does it serve the planet? And as activists, we find it really easy to ask the question, does it serve my community and does it serve the planet? But it's not so easy to ask the question, does it serve myself? And in this new way that I was kind of exploring in the beginning, if everything is interconnected and we're dealing with this interbeing state, this fundamentally dynamic wholeness transforming, then the only way that we can, in a meaningful and continuous way, serve the health of the whole to come forth is if we pay attention to our own health. And that there's nothing wrong with asking, does it serve myself? Because if you don't serve yourself, you're not going to serve the community and the planet for very long. And so that's, for me, maybe a parting gift or advice that I also still have to remind myself of on a regular basis. And when you look into the screen and you see that there are 16 people on the screen that cared enough about this issue to make time for it, then you can also take the time out to recharge and rest, because you know that there's other people doing good work elsewhere, and that it's not you alone that has to do it all. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
You know, it's 6 people that are vast in geographic areas, like we're all over the world too. So that network is just really dynamic. So I want to thank everybody for joining in today too. And Daniel, thank you for taking time to do this. It's been awesome. It's been an awesome presentation and an awesome discussion. Pleasure. And I can share the PDF. I don't know if you have people's emails or something. I have everybody's email, and I'll send out the chat to everybody for sure, and a link to the recording. So I'll send you a PDF of the presentation, and then you can share it with people. That'll be awesome. Great. Thank you. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Bye. Good luck, Johnny, with Nessie. Shame I can't be there. Yeah, and Johnny, thanks for all the links. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Yeah, you have many links to check.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.